Hi, everyone. Welcome to Poet. I'm Radha Marcum, and today I have the pleasure of talking to poet Steven Cramer, author of most recently Departures from Rilke. Before I introduce you to Steven, I'd like to invite you to become a subscriber of the Poet to Poet newsletter on Substack if you aren't already. Just go to poettopoet.substack.com and subscribe for free. In it, you'll find interviews like this one, plus helpful ideas on writing and publishing books of poetry. So again, today I'm thrilled to introduce you to Steven Cramer. Steven Cramer's seventh poetry collection is Departures from Rilke, out from Aerosmith Press this year. His previous volume, Listen, from Mad Hat Press in 2020, was named a must-read by the Massachusetts Center for the Book. Previous books include Clangings and Goodbye to the Orchard, which is the winner of the Sheila Moten Prize from the New England Poetry Club and was named a 2005 Massachusetts Honor Book. His work has appeared in the Atlantic Monthly, Kenyon Review, the Paris Review, Plowshares Poetry, and other journals. Recipient of 2 grants from the Massachusetts Cultural Council and a National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship, he founded and now teaches at the low residency MFA program in creative writing at Lesley University. Not only that, but Steven has been a mentor of mine at Bennington College and beyond, so it's a special honor to have you here, Steven.
It's a special honor to be here and a special pleasure to congratulate you again on winning the Washington Prize for your second collection.
Thank you. Thank you. So Departures from Rilke. So this book has a unique origin story, at least unique among your books. Would you mind sharing a little bit about the process of developing the poems for this book? How was your process different for this book than for others?
Okay, I can do that. I mean, I don't know if this is true for all poets, but it's certainly true for me. When I do publish a book, I usually think that's it. It's my last book in the sense of final, not just most recent. And in this particular case, I'd published Listen, which was unusual for me because it is actually a collection of work over a long arc of years, like over 10 or more years, because it was interrupted by a project book called Clangings. So I had been writing new poems, but I wanted to do something different, but I didn't have much material to do anything different with because I had just published 15 years of work. I was rereading Rilke. I often reread Rilke in translation, although I can puzzle out versions of Rilke. I can puzzle out the originals in the German, but I don't read German idiomatically. And there's a big difference between reading and figuring it out and reading it as if it were your language. I was reading some of the canonical translations. I won't mention the translators because I don't want to diss anybody in public. And they were good translations, but they were so clearly translations that I thought to myself, you're not getting something that you get when you read a poem in English. And I finally decided that something is really texture, is language as paint. These felt like well-made paraphrases. So I took a fairly well-known one and said, what would happen if I just behaved like an editor on the translation, not Rilke's editor? I would not, I wouldn't be that arrogant. But there's a little bit of arrogance in this project. I have to say that. A little bit, oh, I can do better than that, or I can do different than that. And I gave myself 2 limitations. I had to edit out a line's worth of wordage from every stanza. And if I saw a string of adjectives and adverbs, English Rilke is very adjectival and very adverbial, at least the lyrics. So this is from 2-volume collection of his called New Poems, really the first poems that many of us think of as his first great work. And so the second limitation was to turn as many adjectives and adverbs into verbs as possible to see what would happen. And then the other rule was to break any rule about translation, any conventional rule about translation that I could. So if the poem departed almost completely off the premises of the Rilke original or the translation, go with it. And I did one, did another, and I just worked through the 2 volumes very spontaneously. If something just didn't click, I didn't do it. And over 3 months, I found myself with 57 of these departures from Rilke, and they all had the same worksheets. Original German, a Microsoft Translate version, which was utter gibberish, was hilarious, but useful. Then at least 1 or 2 legitimate translations, and then my departure. And they got more and more unruly, and they misbehaved more and more the more I worked on it. And I didn't know it was a book until I had that many and read it through and thought, it reads like a book. I hope that's a long.
Yeah. Well,
I
it's amazing
want to
to
edit that.
no, not at all, because it's fascinating to hear about the constraints that occurred to you to place on this sort of project, if you will, that you weren't necessarily thinking about it as a book project, but that once you had completed this sort of, I mean, that's a remarkable, remarkably short amount of time to have been working on something to have it manifest as
uncomfortably short in a way. But you can't do something that you can't finish something that quickly. And I didn't know. I have friends who tell me when I'm on the right track or not, and I was encouraged to keep going with it. So
yeah. I was actually going to ask you about the role of community in this book and maybe in your work generally.
Well, for me, I'm 70 now, so I've been writing for over, I don't know, I guess I started in 1974. I don't know what 2020, it's 40 years at least. Community has changed for me. Community used to be connected to the colleges and universities I went to, the MFA program I went to, Iowa, and friends from there. I've been lucky to remain friends with some of my former teachers who, over the years, were willing, I don't know if I could say happy, but were willing to read my work without charging me. And then it changed a number of times, different people, but for the last 20 years, I have shown all my poems to 2 poets, Joyce Pesaroff and Teresa Cater, both very accomplished poets, and we care about each other's work and believe in it enough in the general to be tough on it in the particular. It is not a support group, except that it supports the art. And I really don't know what I would do without them. And I'm happy to say they feel the same way about me. There are some other people who I show my work to, but Joyce and Terry are the litmus test for me. This particular book, my wife Hillary read every version before anyone else did of these departures. And she's usually very supportive, and she was supportive, but she was really, when a poem didn't feel eccentric enough, she said, not eccentric enough. There's one other thing I will say, because this may sound a little bit, the project may sound a little bit detached, more like I don't know, making shoes rather than making poems. And that's okay with me. I actually care as much about, I like to say, this is something I made as much as this is something, this is an aspect of me.
Mhm.
But the mask of Rilke, the presence of Rilke, allowed me to write poems to lost friends, to family, allowed me to write some poems that grow out of a feeling of anger at the world in the shape it's in now, that are presided over by something Rilkean, but are not at all Rilke subjects. So it was an interesting release that I wasn't expecting to happen when I was doing, because every one of them was like, well, how do I make it work? You
Mhm.
know, I didn't know what was important to me, but that's, I'm sure you feel that way. You often, it's better not to know what's important to you as you're working. At least it is for me.
Yeah, no, I can relate to what you're saying, in that oftentimes the subject of a poem, or the, the deeper, emotional core, if you will, of a poem, um, if 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 I started there, if I said I want to, so for example, poems about the mass shooting that happened down the street from me, right?
Right.
If I started with the purpose of writing about that event, tragic events, right? This is what we're talking about with your book as well.
Mhm.
Um, the poem would not, it would be a terrible poem
It
to
would
start
probably
with
be
the
a poem of
emotional core.
answers.
It
Yeah.
just wouldn't work. And so it is almost through these masks, or these slant or sideways strategies, and especially with the help of existing art, right? So ekphrastic work, or sitting with someone else's poems and allowing something to come out of that first, is the way into something like that. And you get there by accident,
Yeah.
is my feeling.
Maybe I'm making this up right now, so it may sound stupid. But in some ways, an artwork is by an artist who feels very passionately about something about which they don't know very much, about which they have more questions than answers. Because if you go in with the answers, then you're essentially going to be parroting what you already know.
Who goes to poetry for answers?
Right, right. Well,
Does
Rilke
anyone? I
would have
hope
said,
not.
"You must love the questions."
Yes. Yeah.
It's too bad. I would like a few poems that provided some answers.
So it would be lovely to hear a poem, if you might pick one to give us a taste.
Okay. Um, this is one, it's funny. This is one thing I want to say, and I've noticed this. I've read from the book 4 or 5 times now. And because they are poems based on another writer's work, no matter how much they depart, I find myself sometimes saying, "Oh, I really like this one." And I don't know whether it's kind of, egregious self-praise when I say that, or whether it's an homage to Rilke. It's a very weird stereo, because um, I know the source is uh, is Rilke, but I know the artifact in many ways is not.
Hmm.
So it's an odd, I'm never very comfortable praising my own work, but this is the first time that I've been able to sort of praise my own work by sort of looking over its shoulder at somebody standing behind it. This poem departs quite a bit from Rilke's original, which as I remember is called After the Fire. And there's nothing in it about conflict that would have been contemporary to Rilke. Rilke's not particularly a political poet, certainly not consciously.
Mhm.
Um, as I worked on this, it became a poem very much responding to a situation that we're all too familiar with right now. Bomb site. Morning ignores it. And who knows? The burnt lime trees and pitted block of flats might be fakes. So might that warm crater filling with kids, God knows from where, who play catch with the littlest one's shirt, then stop to watch a tenant's eldest son poke under the crushed, incinerated deck, teasing out twin tea kettles in a wash tub. He looks like he's acting too, for the kids or anyone naive enough to think anyone lived here. Whatever remains is incredible as history now, where everyone's a stranger. Now, I did the war in Ukraine. Russia had invaded Ukraine before I started this project. So that the ways in which the poem responds to that, sort of like in what we were saying, I couldn't have done it if I had sat down. And I mean, I don't feel like I have a right in some ways to comment on what's going on in Ukraine as a fairly comfortable, more than comfortable American. Writing this poem out of Rilke. Oh, that's somebody at our door. Hillary, that's my wife, folks. Maybe we'll have to edit that out. I don't know. Allowing the poem to go in that direction seemed authentic enough. Seemed valid. And there are a number of other ones that are similarly can be read as poems responding to some conflict. I mean, one of the horrible ironies is that there is always a new conflict that a poem like Bomb Site can respond to.
That's right. I mean, as you know, I've written a lot about conflict, wars, weapons of mass destruction. And the thing that strikes me looking back on some of that now is how relevant it still is, you know, despite the specific thing having gone, which is exactly what we're talking about with Rilke here, right?
Yeah.
Because the specific things that he wrote from are still resonating here with us now. So to what do you attribute Rilke's power to continue as a poet who's so relevant in our
well, that's an interesting question because I'm not sure. There's so many different Rilkes. I mean, the Rilkes of the new poems are, you know, lyric, highly compressed, prosodically complicated, whereas the Rilke of the Dueno elegies are meditative, digressive, much freer in rhythm and rhetoric. Rilke's in some ways, Rilke is an odd poet for this particular period because I think of him, whether he's writing a short lyric or whether he's writing something that's more embracing and more and larger in scope. He's a poet of the intense inner life. He's a poet of introspection in some ways. And when I first read him, I was introduced to him by one of my most important teachers, the poet John Anderson, who died a number of years ago. And he read early Rilke, pre-New Poems Rilke, that are almost like prayers. So, and since I think of poetry as the poetry that moves me most, no matter its subject, somehow reaffirms the value of the individual life. So that, I think, is part of what might be relevant about Rilke right now in some ways, is the way that notion of the individual life, I don't want to say soul because I don't believe in the soul. I do believe, I don't even believe in the self, but I do believe in consciousness. I believe in conscious experience as really all we have. I mean, that's how we decide what's good and what's bad, is by what's good for conscious beings. And maybe Rilke's almost ferocious attention to the individual life is kind of a counter to the cultivation of collective experience now, which is a big phrase for something too complicated to get into, but it seems to take place on social media mostly. I should mention that this particular project of departing from another text has quite a history to it. I don't want to claim that it was original to me by any means. It goes way back. The poems that you and I read in Renaissance English lyric, a good number of them were departures from Petrarch that Wyatt and Surrey and others imported into the English language. Lowell, very well known for his imitations. There are more recent examples too. And my own mentor, Donald Justice, wrote a book called Departures, and Departures from Rilke is dedicated to him. And I've thought about that. And one of the things that I think the practice does, without being too conscious about it, is it pays homage to reading as an experience that is a life experience. It's not secondary to life. Does that make sense? Oh.
Yeah, makes so much sense. Yeah, those of us who are enamored with reading are also enamored with, so hearing, so I've experienced this on the page, reading it. I've heard you read now a couple times. You're reading to us today. There's a way in which poems live on the page, and they live in the body, and they live in the body before you even hear it, in a sense. And so that access to the interior experience, I think, can happen on multiple levels with a book, and with the history that precedes that book. So maybe it's a good time to hear another poem from the book.
I'll read a much lighter one. And it's kind of a dark book. Again, I just let the ones that arrested me be the ones that ended up in the book. They are in the order that they are in New Poems, Volume 1 and Volume 2, but only a small selection of the over 150 poems that make up the 2 volumes. I left the gaps where they may. I knew I didn't feel credible doing many of the religious poems. Not that Rilke himself was in any way conventionally religious, but religious iconography came naturally to a poet writing in the 1920s, or bridging the 2 centuries, 19th and 20th century, in a way that it comes naturally to far fewer poets these days. All right, this one needs a little bit of explanation. Its source is a poem in New Poems, I think the second part, called Lute, and a lute talks to you. I couldn't write a poem about a lute or a lute talking. It wasn't in me. So this one really runs far afield. I don't even know whether there's much of the language of the original in it anymore. Few uh, allusions. It's really the only allusive poem in the book, pretty much. I allude to Patty Boyd, who was George Harrison's wife, married George Harrison on the set of A Hard Day's Night. And then Eric Clapton fell in love with Patty Boyd and wrote a song we all know called Layla. George Harrison wrote many love poems to her, one called Something, which a lot of us are, particularly my age, are familiar with. He also wrote one called It's All Too Much, about his love for her. Eric Clapton was nicknamed Slowhand, and he wrote a poem called Bell Bottom Blues that was for Patty Boyd. Patty Boyd went on to be a very successful photographer. So I liked that she wasn't just a rock star's muse. So this is based on lute, and it's called Electric Guitar for Patty Boyd. Hollow body, solid body, archtop, strat, or flying V. My shape's a paired avocado, a frying egg, yolk broken, or nearly any rock. My dark sounds utter hyperbole, as in Eric's bottleneck falsetto to his Layla, formerly George's Something All Too Much. Her gold ringlets, bloating slow hands, bell-bottom jeans with blues. Plenty other muses teased voltage from my pickups, but the duende she awoke could play. Until who knew whether I fed back through her or she through me. Duende is Lorca's word for the spirit of, the dark spirit of genius.
Mm-hmm.
So when I did that, I thought, man, you can sort of go anywhere with these things. I mean, I think maybe there's something in the Rilke lute poem that has that rhetoric of, you know, A, B, B, A. It's called chiasmus, you know, whether I fed through her or she through me. I think that may be the connective tissue with that poem, but I'd have to look it up again.
Mm-hmm. So with that poem, was that a moment where you thought, okay, I'm departing from the previous departure? Like there are many departures in the process of the book.
Yeah, well, one of the things I realized, and I don't remember how it relates to that particular poem, I knew at some point that the book had to lighten up somewhat, because there are a number of very dark, very visceral. He has a poem called Last Judgment. I can read it, but you know, it's like, wow, that is the imagination at its most visceral in a literal sense. I'll read it if you want. I mean, I have never read it out loud. And
Yeah,
there's also, he has a poem called Leda. And it's the Leda and the Swan myth, which, you know, Yeats wrote Leda and the Swan. Both Rilke and Yeats, and pretty much anyone else who has dealt with that myth who's male, has airbrushed the reality of it,
mm-hmm.
that it's a sexual assault.
Mm-hmm.
And people talk about the Yeats poem and the Rilke poem and the aesthetics of it and the use of mythological iconography. But very few people say, wait a minute, it's about a rape. And there was a student of mine, and I was teaching it, and she said, Steven, could we at least acknowledge that? And that became the impetus. I'm not going to read it out loud because somebody actually told me they didn't want to hear it. And I honor that. I sort of don't, I mean, because it tries to fill in that gaping blank in poems that deal with Zeus sexually assaulting Leda. So it was, some of these poems do argue with Rilke, I guess is the best way to put it, or at least argue with some of the assumptions that grow out of the lyric tradition that Rilke was part of,
Mhm,
which is fundamentally male until, thank God, it's not anymore.
mhm.
I wear an Emily Dickinson pin because I think Emily Dickinson, at least poetry in English, she's really one of the pioneers of a lyric tradition that is boldly female. I don't know how else to say it. And you know, the fact that she's almost as good as Shakespeare doesn't hurt. Okay. Last Judgment. I've never read this one aloud. I don't remember. Okay, I got it. Terrified past panic, strict lines collapsed, their shredded flesh more wound than flesh. They play dead in a ditch, but won't give up their shrouds, which have grown on them. Then the angels come, oiling eye sockets, joints, and stuffing everyone's armpits left or right with an item they failed to desecrate in life. This way, something saved remains warm, and God's hands don't get cold as he sorts the good ones from the ones who've spoiled. And again, I don't think the Rilke version, at least the translation of it, are as bloody bodily as that is. I used it as an invitation. And the notion of sorting in the poem, which of course has all sorts of relevances since post 20th century atrocities. In fact, if I can, there's a great poem by the Polish poet Zbigniew Herbert,
Hmm.
at the gate to the valley. I don't know if you know that.
I do, yeah.
It's the Last Judgment. They're separating the saved from the damned, but you suddenly realize this could be taking place at a train station. This could be taking place outside a death camp. It's an incredible. Maybe we read it together. I don't know.
I think I came to Herbert a little bit later, but I think he's sort of an underrated voice in the 20th century.
I feel, I mean, the Polish poets of his generation and just afterwards, including Adam Zagajewski, are some of the most the power of their reminder that we live in history is unlike really any other national poetry that I know of. And Herbert, maybe because he was so eccentric in form, the short lines, the lack of punctuation. I mean, all his work's been carried over into English. But maybe that's why, unlike Szymborska and Miłosz, she's somewhat less immediately accessible than they are. I mean, because Miłosz, you can read him and you can think that was a really good lecture,
Yeah,
even though you end up in fields with gooseberries, I mean,
yeah,
you don't
yeah,
you stay in his mind until
yeah.
you look through his eyes.
Well, there's a sort of driving coherence that
Yeah.
Szymborska and Miłosz both have. Zagajewski too. Like you said, Herbert, he's embodying a different part of the spirit of that time, which was more on the chaotic side, or the rug pulled out from underneath us all.
Yeah.
And I think those are important modes to have within a landscape of poetry in a time.
Or Szymborska can be hilarious,
Yeah.
which is one of the, and Miłosz is just, he's so brilliant that you just have to stand still and listen. But so is Herbert. It's just that Herbert is more oblique.
Yeah.
But some of that particular poem is probably my favorite of his, because it captures, it's up there with some of Paul Celan's poems as poems that find a way to talk about the most unspeakable act of period of European history, and it radiates out into something that's larger than this world.
So I had a question about, I mean, the richness of the development of the work for this book. I feel we could probably spend another, 2 hours unpacking, and it would be so joyous. But I think people are really curious, when you look at a finished book like Departures, a couple of things, like, how did you decide how to organize the poems? And maybe before that, how did you decide which poems would make the cut? How did you decide what wouldn't go in this book?
Right. Well, first of all, I didn't have to decide the order for this book, because I decided early on I was going to maintain Rilke's order, even with the large gaps in between the poems that I departed from and the poems that I didn't. This is why I like good editors. When I sent it to Arrowsmith, the editor of which is Oskol Meldenchuk, the great Ukrainian-American novelist who founded Anye and founded Arrowsmith. How's that? That's not too bad a record. He emailed me and said, "We'd love to do this book. You can't, that first poem's got to go." And the first poem was a parody. It's the only poem that was out of order. And it was the most famous Rilke lyric, an archaic torso of Apollo, the poem that ends, "You must change your life," that has been translated, a gazillion times. And I did a parody of it. I mean, it ends, "Try life for a change," because the German anderen is the last word, change, not life. I wanted to write a version that ended with the word change. But Oskol said, "We love the book, but you got that, this poem you don't want to begin with slapstick."
Right.
And he was absolutely right. And, I also it didn't take long for me to say yes. There was another poem that I was working on. I don't remember I was going to call it The Autocrat. I don't remember. But it was one of those poems that was a portrait of a real jerk. And I thought, I can turn this into a Putin-like character. And I tried and tried and tried, but Terry and Joyce said, "It's not working. You have to get rid of that." And, that's the kind of thing that good friends who are fellow artists say to you. It hurts. I mean, it was 1 out of 57 poems, so it wasn't, that didn't hurt that much, but you really do need people who will gently send you back to the drawing board, or saying, "No, sorry, not this." I meet a lot of people who are in writing groups, and they say, "Well, it's really kind of a support group." And I think, you don't have to be mean. You don't have to be ruthless to be rigorous. And I do sometimes wonder and I wonder this about programs too, about creative writing programs, how many of them, whatever their standards are, whatever aesthetic they come from, and things are so up for grabs. But if essentially the mission is the psychology of the artist, not the form given to feeling of the artwork, something's missing. And that, again, I went to Iowa, and I should have a T-shirt that says "I survived Iowa." The ethos was terrible, and I don't wish that kind of experience on anyone. But if a crit isn't really a crit, there's probably not going to be. You're not going to leave excited about more work to do, which to me is the definition of a good workshop, crit, whatever you call it, is that the person, I mean, unless you bring in something that needs no work, And what work it needs is not going to be either obvious or objectively verifiable. You can't do that. But if you have something that's in process and you don't leave with a sense of re-entering the process, then that program is selling you snake oil. I don't know how I got on the MFA program. It's just that I've seen some of the arguments against workshops that include critique.
Mhm.
And I've seen arguments based essentially on cultural issues. And I understand completely how there have been certain assumptions about what a good piece of writing is that need to be re-examined carefully, because there's no such thing as a non-ideological aesthetic. But if the premise of the conversation isn't in some way aesthetic, what's working, the difference between interesting and not interesting, as subjective as that, if that isn't part of the discourse, I don't see how the writer's relationship to their work strengthens.
I think it's such a challenge because, as you said, there are so many different aesthetic principles at work in
Yeah.
contemporary poetry. And so when I start a new workshop, and I don't know the folks who are in it, I mean, it's a bit like saying, okay, we're starting a music workshop and somebody over here is writing rap and, this other person's writing an epic opera. So my job, I always feel, is to understand what not even, not just the individual is trying to do, but what each individual poem is asking for, and the rigor is to that poem. It's to, and, the question I like to ask, and maybe this, brings us back to Departures from Rilke, is, there's always this question, what's at stake? I don't know if that's a question that, and I don't think it's a bad question necessarily, like what's the hook? What's this poem? What's it driving at? But I think a better question that I like to ask is, what's at play? What's at play? And the play is the form. The
I
play
like that.
is the sense of engaging in conversation with the material, with poets of the past, whatever it may be. So I think there's a lot of room to lighten up in that, to like bring rigor to that lightness. I'm not quite sure I'm
I think
articulating it.
play is hard work, first of all. I mean, one can get glibly paradoxical about these concepts, but I sent a submission back to a student I'm working with right now, and I quoted something my teacher, Donald Justice, said to me on a poem. It's all he wrote. He wrote, "Excellent perceptions," like that. How much does the poem matter? And how you answer that question, that the poem matters, it can matter because its play is so surprising that you want to keep playing with it every time you go back to it. Or it can do that thing that another teacher of mine said, it can say the toughest thing. I mean, art doesn't have to be a door into the dark. But if it's a door into the light, I'm not that interested in light I've already seen. Or if I have already seen it, I want to see some new shading into the light. I'm really mixing my metaphors here myself now. But so every once in a while, I feel comfortable enough with a student when they've reached a certain point where I say, okay, you're a really good writer. Who cares? And by that, I don't mean, so what? I mean, who cares in this poem? And I remember something you said to me at Bennington a while back. It was like maybe near the end of, I don't know how many semesters we worked together. You said, I think you're getting harder on me as I get better.
Did I say that?
And I
That's
said,
probably
"Bada
true.
bingo."
So,
But
so
you
do you
don't do
feel like you,
that unless you think someone has a future,
sure.
you know?
Um, so do you feel like you've gotten harder on yourself as you've gotten better? Like, is that part of this like internal development of a writer? And
Um, yeah, I, 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 I think I've gotten harder on myself in the sense that and this may relate to the Departures book, which I really feel was in some ways a gift, but a gift I was asking for because I didn't want to repeat myself. I do think of my books as very different from one another. And that matters a lot to me. And I also, with the exception of, I mean, this, Departures from Rilke came already ordered.
mhm,
Uh, Clangings, which is a book length poem, all in the same uh, 5 quatrain sections. That I needed a lot of help with. Listen is a book in 4 sections, and certain parts of it are very much a miscellany, and I don't mind that. I didn't try to over determine anything thematically about it. Philip Larkin had this great notion. He said, and somebody asked him, "How do you order your books?" He said, "Well, I try to do it like a variety show.
mhm.
First you have the dancing horses, and then you have, the opera singer, and then you have the person who spins plate, and then you have the one who recites Shakespeare." So that notion of variety, I
Mhm.
really get bored turning pages of a book and every poem looks the same before I've read them. And, I can sometimes be fooling myself. They can be very different. But go back and read a book, any book by Richard Hugo, who was a wonderful poet. But I did it recently. I thought, man, he found the Richard Hugo trademark and stuck with it. And it doesn't hold up as well as one might wish it did.
Yeah,
You
who
know?
was it that said reputation is based on repetition? Something like that. Repetition is, was that Ashbury? I want to say it's Ashbury, somebody like that.
So once you find the style,
Yeah,
you
you
just
just keep doing it. That is one strategy
automatic
versus
pilot, right?
what I um, feel is a really generous invitation and perspective that you can provide in terms of the development of each of those books of yours as being unique
Mm.
and also evolving and trying different things and not sticking to a brand,
Yeah.
personal poetic brand. I think, there's some risks to that, right? In career, possibly in publishing. Um, how do you think about so maybe to ask the question a little differently, what advice would you give to poets who are emerging into the publishing space or are on a second book project or a third book project? How would you um, encourage them not to get stuck in the brand and the voice, or would you say, yeah, go ahead, try that?
Um, the thing that immediately occurred, I mean, those are very different stages. The person who has enough poems for a book but hasn't published a first book yet. Um, in some ways, they need to have more of an eye on what an editor might have time to be interested in than someone who, well, obviously, who has a publisher who is, open to reading the next work. There are fewer and fewer of those. Um, but I do think, um, for me, it's almost always a question of form. I don't say, "Oh, I've written enough about that. Now I should write about something else." That
Topic.
just,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Subject matter.
Mhm.
I really try to think as little about subject matter as possible. The language on the page leads to subject matter.
Mhm.
Um, if you have published a book and you think it's a good book and you like it, try writing bad poems in new ways if you want to get to something else. Because I guarantee you will write, because you can't help but have quite an allegiance to what worked. If you break the back of the what worked notion, you're going to write in new ways, and maybe not well for a while, but that's okay too. And I don't know about others, but our late poet laureate Louise Glick, who was a teacher of mine, a terrifying teacher, and I feel very sad that there will be no more Louise Glick poems. An audience member after a reading was, how do you know when a poem is done? She said, my friends tell me. Mm-hmm. And she wasn't kidding. Mm-hmm. She elaborated a bit and said, sometimes the friends make suggestions that encourage me to do something very different than what they suggested. But she says, I am so invested in the success of that individual work that I'm the last person to judge it at some point. Mm. And I know of very few people. Rilke, when he reached a dead end with his work, he went to Paris and started working as Rodin's assistant. And Rodin said, you got to get out in the world. And that's where these thing poems in new poems came from, So Yeats, after becoming a very successful poet, appealed to Pound. I don't know if he said it quite this way, but he was essentially saying, how do I get modern? Mm. And Pound had an enormous influence on what we think of as the great late period, middle to late period Yeats poems. Mm-hmm. So I don't know. I was talking to somebody in a bookstore, was working on a novel, and I said, who do you show it to? And he gave me this look like, show it to? Hmm. And he and I said, yeah, how do you know what effect it might have on an audience if you don't have an audience behind the scenes? And he looked like he'd never thought of that before. Maybe that's why he's working in a bookstore.
Yeah. Well, I feel that the secret ingredient to any success, on the page, I mean, we could argue about what success is, but any sense of having created something of any worth, the secret ingredient to that is to have surrounded oneself with the right mentors, the right peers, the right, voices of the dead. Any work that seems to be of any value has had that kind of, is in dialogue in that way.
That's why I think the best, I don't want to keep sort of reducing this to creative writing graduate programs or undergraduate or whatever, but people sometimes ask me what makes a good MFA program. And of course, faculty who teach really passionately, but also any good creative writing program has to be almost as much a creative reading program. Mm. You don't learn how to close read and reverse engineer from what you read to what you write. Again, it's snake oil. Because I know of no writer worthy of the name who wasn't a passionate reader first. And by passionate, I don't just mean you let it wash over you. You go back and say, how did they do that? How did, I keep going back to Larkin. How did Larkin in that poem, High Windows, manage to get to that last stanza, which totally out of the blue? Where's the hint? Oh, how would I do that? And, that's not plagiarism. That's influence. Mm-hmm. Take the last stanza of Keats's Autumn Ode and compare it to the last stanza of Stephen's Sunday Morning. Put them together and you realize that Keats's last stanza is inhabiting the mind of Stevens as he's writing that last stanza. This is not original to me. Many have noticed that, but it's a great moment where you can see how influence is enlivening.
Yeah. Yeah. Have good influences.
Absolutely. And have them be right, and have them raise the bar on you. You know, there's a great, I don't know, we're really going on here. The composer Alan Shawn, who I knew at Bennington, you knew
Yeah,
Alan.
he was my advisor.
Oh, we were once talking about, why do you do this? Because, I know I'm not going to be Yeats, and he knows he's not going to be Beethoven. And he said, yeah, but if you work on it and take it really seriously, you can feel like you're sort of in the same room. They may be way over in the other corner there, but it's just a privilege to be in the same room with them. Mm-hmm. And that to me was, really mattered a lot. I mean, because there was nothing competitive or overly abject about it. He was taking himself very seriously, but at the same time saying, this is what went on before that I love is still alive. I hate the word foundation. Oh, I should read this for foundation. I hate that. Living tradition, I'll go with that. And traditions change. Traditions are very different now than they were when we worked together at Bennington. And that's been a real education for me as a teacher,
But isn't that the beauty, though? I mean, yeah. Well, it's an honor to be in this room with you and to have had your mentorship and your good guidance over the years. So maybe you'd like to read one last poem to close, and then we'll tell people to find your book.
Okay. How about one about writing?
Perfect.
There we go. Where are you? There we go. Okay, this is one I remember. Again, the title was The Blind Man, and it said Paris underneath. Rilke wrote a number of poems about people he saw on the street while he was living in Paris. I didn't want to write a poem about a blind man. The concept of not being able to see was interesting. Mm-hmm. So again, I don't really recall how much of this, the city references were definitely Rilke's, but the subject matter, not at all. There's a reference to a cursor. Rilke did not write on a computer. Blind. This drab ramble in a city known as anonymous. Its unnamed streets fork like cracks in a white coffee mug, empty as the cursor's pulsing square, stared at until nothing else sinks in. Then a hint happens, like a swell, a wave, yet wary as the blind before a crosswalk, who can't see when to go, and lift a hand as if to make an oath, and the hand's taken. That seemed to me to be, that's what you want. You reach out the hand, sometimes it gets taken.
It's beautiful.
Beautiful.
There's so many beautiful gestures in the book. I think that's one of the things I love in Rilke, and I love in this book too.
Well, again, I don't want to.
Humanness.
The Rilkean turn became kind of. I did internalize that. I probably of anything of all that's Rilke in this book, those turns were what I gratefully received from doing this project. Mm-hmm. I got to do it myself.
Yeah.
I have written a few new poems since the book, not that.
Yeah. Well, it's been such a pleasure. I'm
Thank
just,
you,
yeah,
Radha.
very honored that you spent this time with us, and encourage everyone to go check out Departures from Rilke, buy the book. Where can they find you, and where can they buy the book?
Oh, well, I have a website, which is stevencramer.com. It's on the Arrowsmith Press website. And you can order it directly from Arrowsmith. It's on Amazon, but
But don't order it there, because then
no.
Aerosmith won't get the benefit of this.
Right. No, Arrowsmith is certainly, and just Google Arrowsmith Press. I don't know
Oh, that's
uh,
okay. Yeah.
their URL.
I'll put the link in the notes there. So that's
And I
perfect.
do want to say Arrowsmith Press, aside from being a wonderful press that was just a joy to work with personally, Oskald, the work he does on behalf of the free people of Ukraine is really worth paying attention to. And it's both literary, but not just literary. And we are forgetting. In some ways, we are forgetting that, and understandably so, because new atrocities show up in our lives all the time.
Well, literature might matter in some small way. And
Oskald
I
is
take
great because
that to
he
heart.
says it's wrong. Poetry matter. Poetry makes something happen, and you know what? It really does in these countries with cultures that embrace it, like Ukraine, like my friend Kevin Proofer just came back from Romania, where he gave a reading. I thought, wow, they really treat their poets well, but they care about poetry.
Yeah.
You know?
Yes. And so do we. So
We do.
thanks again.
All right.